This is where the future begins. It's time to invest in our future. It's time to help our schools improve for the future. And it's time to give our educators what they need to innovate for the future. Because the future of Texas is in our public schools.
Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas believes in honest conversations like the one you're about to see. For thoughtful insights related to healthcare policy, check out our Blue Promise podcast and videos. Learn more at standingwithtexas.com.
Good morning, I'm Ross Ramsey. Welcome to Coronavirus in Texas, a virtual event series from the Texas Tribune. Like most of the state, the Tribune has temporarily paused its in-person live events, but we're moving the conversation online with this series of virtual interviews. I'm here this morning with Texas Comptroller Glenn Hegar to talk for 45 minutes or so about how the coronavirus outbreak is affecting the state's economy and the state's budget. Throughout the conversation, Comptroller Hegar will also be answering questions that have been submitted by our readers. I want to thank our sponsors for supporting today's conversation: Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas, the Beer Alliance of Texas, Kamek and Strong PC, and Raise Your Hands Texas. We would also like to thank KXAN, KPRC2, Univision 62, and Community Impact for their media support. Though donors and corporate sponsors underwrite our events, they play no role in determining the content, panelists, or line of questioning. Want to keep tabs on the latest coronavirus news in Texas? Subscribe to our evening newsletter for updates at trib.it/coronavirus. Let's get started. Glenn Hegar was elected as the 36th Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts in 2014. In that capacity, he serves as the state's treasurer, check writer, tax collector, procurement officer, and revenue estimator. Before his election to statewide office, he served as a member of the Texas House from 2003 to 2007 and of the Texas Senate from 2007 until he became Comptroller. Morning, Glenn. How are you?
It's good to be with you, Ross.
I guess the first question is the big question. What's going on with the Texas economy? If you can kind of walk us through the situation we're in, and then we'll get into the effects of that.
Yeah, I mean, first, I just kind of, obviously, if you look back just a month ago, Texas economy was doing very strong. I mean, we had 50,000 job gains in the month of February. Sales tax receipts for this fiscal year were tracking just slightly ahead of our revenue estimate of October. And then, unfortunately, the global pandemic came to the United States and came to Texas, and double that with, unfortunately, a Saudi-Russia oil war, price war that's going on right now. And so with the rapid slowdown in the state economy, more so impacted from the global pandemic, and a lot of businesses are forcibly being shut down because we're trying to slow the curve and slow the pandemic. Texas economy has essentially, unfortunately, like the rest of the U.S. and much of the world, we've entered into a recession at this time period. And, unfortunately, the numbers have changed rapidly. If you go back just a couple of weeks ago, some of the forecasting services we used were talking about maybe 6% unemployment nationwide. By the end of the week, it had obviously gotten worse, and we were talking about potentially 9% unemployment. And, undoubtedly now we're looking at low double-digit unemployment across the nation, because the question is how long is this unfortunate slowdown that we're having in the state economy, which is forced by, the pandemic and trying to essentially slow the curve.
How much of this, I don't know that it's even possible to answer this, but how much of the current troubles in Texas are attributable to pandemic, and how much of it's the oil thing? We'd be in trouble just with oil, right?
Well, I think obviously the downturn in the oil price would hurt the state economy. If you look at sales tax receipts coming into the Treasury from the mining, the industry, oil and gas, just in the last, this fiscal year, we're slightly down compared to the year before. And so the point being is, even before the price war started, initiated several weeks ago, we were seeing a little bit of a slowdown already. And the question was that going to ripple effect over into other industry sectors, such as manufacturing, as it did in 2015 and 2016? But it's not near as deep as having a massive number of different businesses closed overnight and closed for extended period of time. So the point being is, I think the downturn in oil prices would hurt certain regions of the state, would have a drag effect on the economy, but it wouldn't necessarily drag us into a state recession. It's more the pandemic that is significantly causing an unbelievable drag on this economy, as well as the economy of the U.S. and around the world.
So legislator calls you. I imagine you've had 6 calls an hour since this started, maybe more than 6,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Let's just say, as I tell people, thankfully I have unlimited text, unlimited cell minutes right now, because it's more than just a few. Yes, but go ahead with your question.
So what kind of questions are they asking, and what kinds of answers are you giving them? I know that you're to some extent flying blind here.
Well, we look back, for example, just to kind of talk about, are we flying blind, or do we have a little bit of information? If you look at tax receipts for the state of Texas right now, the receipts that we had last month, that was February collections. And so what businesses collected in February, they remit to us in March. When we start collecting sales tax for this month in April on the 20th of the month, going through the end of the month, that's for March collections. Well, obviously, the pandemic and the slowdown wasn't until half of the month through. So you are correct that we don't have real good data to be able to look at right now as actual collections in the state. It's going to be a lag of a couple of months. However, my team, they went back and looked at what happened to the state economy back after the great financial crisis, what happened after 9/11, to find some parallels, trying to look at some other types of economic data to be able to give us a glimpse into what we think is going to happen before we have real numbers. But legislators are really concerned, to answer your question, what is going on with the DC packages? What does that mean for dollars that's come into the state of Texas? What does that mean for local governments? What do we have the authority and power to do as far as being able to give taxpayers some type of temporary relief or a blanket exemption for certain industry sectors? How wide should that be, whether it's sales tax, whether it's also property taxes, where the appraisal values, are they going to be for 2020? Can we use 2019 numbers? I mean, there are a host of questions. Is there dollars the state can utilize to be able to help local governments transition until they get their federal dollars? Are there dollars we can use for trying to stand up some type of entity to help figure out for businesses, how do they go to the federal government, tap into part of the package? I mean, the range of questions just literally kind of goes on and on as people are trying to grapple with this rapid deterioration for so many businesses and individuals. How do we figure out solutions immediately? And unfortunately, a lot of these scenarios we've never had before. So we don't have literally a bridge or a program in place that can be able to find quick, easy solutions, unfortunately.
Are you preparing them for a hit of a certain size? I mean, a year ago, the legislature was in regular session writing a budget. You were giving them some guidance on what the revenue estimate would be for the next 2 years. We're now, a little more than halfway into the first year of a 2-year budget. They're obviously going to have to change their spending plans. How quickly and how much?
Well, I think immediately we need to, at least in my office, I've told my staff, we are freezing hires. We're not doing salary adjustments. We're looking at all kinds of ways, whether it's IT projects that we need to put off the shelf for now to be able to postpone those, all types of ways that we can save dollars, at least within our agency. I've looked at whether it's the Economic Stabilization Fund. We had talked about at the end of this current biennium that fund balance would be $9.3 billion. Obviously, it's going to be slightly less. I have said that I felt like it would probably be in the mid $8.5 billion range or slightly above.
So actually just slightly less, yeah.
Yeah, we'll still have a significant amount of money in the Economic Stabilization Fund, but we also looked at the projects that the legislature appropriated last session. So how many of those dollars are still in the ESF that have not been drawn down by agencies? Can we put a postpone on those? Unfortunately, a lot of those projects, I've got a list, I've provided that to some of leadership, but unfortunately, a lot of those projects, over $2 billion that haven't been spent yet, unfortunately, a lot of those were for Hurricane Harvey relief to either agencies or higher education agencies, institutions, or also it may be flood related. In other words, trying to go out and do much more GIS mapping, as well as state schools, our state hospitals. So but at the end of the day, over $8 billion is still a significant amount of money. We've looked at other states, what they are doing. We're trying to provide a recommendation for leadership that it's better to ask agencies to reduce their budgets for a longer duration than a shorter duration. So you're better to go shallow for long and still attain a significant savings for this biennium and next biennium than waiting 6 more months and have to go deeper. As an agency head, I have more flexibility. If I can start now, which is why I've implemented in my agency, we are looking for all the ways that we can go ahead and cut our spending today.
Is there any directive or instruction that you know of going to the other agencies in state government that says, hey, you better pull back on the reins there?
Yeah, I think really, the number one thing is, and we talked to leadership about this, obviously some agencies are going to have increased spending because of the coronavirus pandemic and trying to make sure that they have the resources. We are working with agencies to track those dollars. So obviously you need to exempt Medicaid, you need to exempt the foundation school program, CHIP, you also need to exempt those portions. And so we're trying to work mechanically to be able to get this set up so we can bifurcate those. Especially the coronavirus expenses, which is normally not the case when leadership is asked. So I know everybody is extremely busy right now. We're trying to get over this initial hurdle that we're having in the state of Texas, and then we can begin to roll into asking agencies. But at least on calls that we've had with agency heads, as we're all working together to deal with various issues, we've already recommended to them several weeks ago, if we were you, because Glenn has already instructed us to start looking at our budget, and we would highly suggest you begin that now as well, even before that comes from leadership.
Okay, and you've told the legislature that you're going to do another an adjustment to your revenue estimate in midsummer?
That's right. Normally, we're working on our cash flow analysis right now for next fiscal year because, as you know, we'll go out this summer for short-term borrowing to be able to cash flow since we send school districts 50% of their money in September, October, and November. So that causes my mismatch in the Treasury at the end of the calendar year. And so we just felt like it's appropriate this summer. We'll have a little bit better data. Right now, we're looking at a lot of non-traditional data points to try to figure out exactly what does this mean to the state economy. So in a few months, as I mentioned, we start having real hard data numbers for tax collections in the state of Texas. We'll be able to give hopefully a much more accurate forecast for this current biennium than if we tried to do that today. Really, right now, it's just all back of the envelope numbers. And I mean, I had a member yesterday asking me, can you tell me what does this mean for the next budget cycle? And I said, the reality is we don't have enough data to tell you what it means for this current budget cycle that we're in, much less to start forecasting for the next 2 years. So I really need a few more months to get some real confirmed data for Treasury numbers. And so, yes, I've said that in July, we would most likely come out with our next revised estimate. But however, with that being said, be forewarned that it is probably going to be a revised downward adjustment of several $1 billion.
Are you confident that that's going to be the last adjustment? In 1986, when the state had the big oil crunch and oil and gas was a even bigger component of state revenue at the time, and they did a revised revenue estimate. This is bad. It's terrible. They told all the legislators it's going to be, shorter sheets, and then they had to revise the revision.
They revised it four times, and so we're
already keeping score here.
Yes, your question is about 3.5 weeks late in my agency because I've asked, what would be the timing of this, and as one of them mentioned, I think it was Mike Reisig, who was around then, and he said, look, we provided an estimate. The next month we gave another one. It got worse. The next one, it got worse. And the point being is, let's try to make sure we've got some real good data before we try to jump out and start giving downward revisions because it is so fluid. And we're looked back at, like I said, the great financial crisis. We looked back at 9/11, and none of those are real parallels to the event that we're having today. And just to make a point, for example, if you look at hotel occupancy rates across the nation, after 9/11 in October and November in Texas, if I recall correctly, they were down roughly about 13% in October and 28% in November, and roughly stabilized by the end of the fiscal year. However, right now they are down. The occupancy rates across the nation is 23%. So that means they're down 67.5% compared to the same time last year, which is an all-time low. So, you can't really compare it to exactly prior events. You're just trying to get a glimpse as what you think this may mean, but it's not an exact parallel. So you really need to get some good hard data before you start giving a back of the envelope adjustment and hopefully not paint a picture that is worse than what it really is.
We have a question. The first audience question is from a former legislator, Letitia Van Depute, old friend of yours. Will the state be able to meet its financial obligations in the second year of this 2-year budget without having to return for a special session? Are you telling lawmakers they're going to have to come back?
No, I think we can cash flow. Obviously, there's a lot of unknowns that we have. We can cash flow this year. We feel like we can cash flow next year. Fortunately, we have a large economic stabilization fund balance, as I mentioned earlier. We project we'll continue to have one during the meantime right now. Mm-hmm. And I can use those dollars to cash flow with if need be. And sometimes we do. We take small amounts out, use them, and then transfer them back and pay, interest to the ESF with GR. We've done that for years. And so therefore we feel as though we can cash flow and there's really not a need for a special session. And if you think about it, January of 21 is going to come up really quicker than we all think anyway. So they're going to be back in session.
Right. A lot of this goes down line, and I know it's not your direct responsibility, but you're, involved in it. And there's 2 tacks I want to take here. I want to ask, this is an audience question from Jim. Cities are being decimated by the shift to online shopping anyway, and it's compounded during the shelter-in-place stuff. They're dependent on local sales taxes to a great extent. What are you telling city officials and local officials about the budget prospects for them?
Yeah, obviously, sales tax numbers are going to be reduced. I was on a call with a lot of the big city mayors just last week, and I was providing them a couple of data points, which they've got good staff that can tell them and project. But the fact is the numbers are going to be lower. A couple of the things that I've tried to, as members are wanting me to ask to try to provide sales tax deferrals for businesses, and we have that authority. However, the authority is for a blanket deferral. And, unlike Hurricane Harvey, which would have been regional to a certain region of the state of Texas that was impacted, that would be for the entire state of Texas and for every single business. And not every business is closed. Not every business is shut down. So we're trying to take it in a fair-minded manner of trying to be very delicate with the balance. And at the same time, the point being is if I gave a deferral across the entire state of Texas for every business for sales tax collections, well, then I'm also making that decision for 1,633 local jurisdictions that get a portion of that sales tax. And so, that's why that blanket deferral doesn't really work, and I've talked a lot about that's been one of the main questions I've talked to members over, the last 3 weeks personally with. And so we think that numbers are going to be decreasing. One of the things from the federal government in package number 3, it looks as though the dollars that would come to the state of Texas, whether it's Texas and or local governments, is a little over $11 billion. 55% of those dollars are for Texas. 45% of those are for local governments. So there are some dollars immediately from the federal government that can help supplant some of that decrease. But really, those dollars are really for fighting the coronavirus and dollars directly related to those expenses. Now, package number 4 that DC is talking about right now would be more of a direct assistance, at least the discussion, but we don't know. We don't see any details yet. That would be to the state, to locals, as well as maybe some type of transportation package for a stimulus to some degree.
Okay. I was talking to State Representative Donna Howard, who's on the Appropriations Committee, elbow deep in all of this stuff. And she referred to a conversation I guess you guys had about FMAP. This is money that comes in from Medicaid, and said that there's a potential here for Texas to get much more FMAP money than they've gotten in the past, but it might come with some strings attached. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So package number 2 that DC passed and the president signed had an increased FMAP match for the states, for all states, of 6.2% for the first 2 quarters of this year. So therefore, that roughly meant about an additional $1 billion to the state of Texas. As I was on a call with my counterparts in the treasuries across the nation, and during that first call a few weeks ago, it was pretty evident that, yes, this is very impactful to Texas. However, we're in much better shape than a lot of these other states because they're trying to figure out how can they cash flow. And one of the things we talked about last week of trying to all be unified to hopefully encourage Congress to put in package number 4 is to extend that FMAP match, that 6.2%, for additional quarters, because for 2 quarters, that's roughly about $1 billion extra for the state of Texas, which obviously that means $1 billion we can save in state money for Medicaid. but we can also free up $1 billion that we can either utilize for something else, or we don't have to spend as we're looking for ways to reduce the current budget.
Okay, I understand that comes with some strings. So like you can't, you have to keep everybody who was enrolled in Medicaid in March of 2020 on the rolls without reapplying and all of that in the way that they normally would in Texas. Is there going to be political resistance to that, even though it's a big pot of money?
Yeah, I don't know. We're still trying to figure out the exact details of what those strings may be. And obviously HHSC is much more the expert than we are. But, I don't think that, obviously I'm not a policymaker anymore. That's the legislature. But to me, I don't think there'll be significant pushback to try to keep the continued roles that we've had on the rolls, because these are individuals that, one, some of them may be losing their jobs, part-time, hourly workers that have been reduced, and trying to make sure that we help all Texans get through this unfortunate downturn that unfortunately it looks like it's going to be a little bit longer, and we're not going to have, a quick recovery. It's going to be a longer drag out. So I think, most members, as I've talked to them, is trying to, how do we work together as Texans, and how do we make sure to get through this? We've gotten through these things before, but we're going to get through it again if we all work together. Yeah.
The other downline thing, I asked you about cities and counties a little bit. The state is about to be in the next cycle of school finance funding. We're doing property appraisals. You get your notice in May, all of that kind of stuff. You do your protests. That's a little messed up now, isn't it? It's hard to do the appraisals and get out and do those. It's nobody's really, I haven't heard much about how people are going to proceed with protests and how you even do that with social distancing and with people inside. And the school districts are in disarray because they're closed right now. Can you walk us through some of those numbers and some of that process?
Yeah, as you mentioned, you hit the exact point on, as though as property notices are going out, those appraisal notices for the current values. The question is how is that going to impact how appraisal districts function? I've talked to some of them. They've been calling my office for the last month, trying to make sure what do we have flexibility in giving them, in other words, how they do business, because people can't walk in their door. And a lot of our rural communities, they're not set up like your major suburban urban appraisal districts, whereby you can protest online, you can make phone calls, you already have those informal protests. And so they're trying to move in that direction. But we were asked, for example, could we just use 2019 values for 2020 to leave everything the way it was?
Trying to freeze the books where they are.
Yeah, that's exactly right. But unfortunately, state statute requires us to look at it as of January 1. So therefore, statute doesn't allow us. And so we're trying to work with appraisal districts the best we can to give them assistance in how do they meet this demand that they know is going to be there. And the taxpayers, they need to have that opportunity to go through a due process if they want to protest their properties. But you're right. There's everything, not just in property taxes, but a lot of other areas, people are scrambling pretty hard to just continue to figure out how do we do business in, unfortunately, a very unique and different environment than we've ever seen before.
So how do you, I guess the big problem here is that your revenue is falling at the same time that demand for government services is probably rising and potentially rising. It's, it's rising obviously in areas like unemployment assistance, but that's going to come down line in other areas. At what point does the legislature have to actually stick its hand in here and operate on this stuff? Can they wait until 2020, whenever that next session is?
Well, I think if we do a combination of things, in other words, there's not one tool in the toolbox that is going to fix everything. That's why you have an entire toolbox. And Texas, as you know, has a lot of tools in its toolbox. One of those is the agencies to reduce expenditures, which I think, we're going to try to do. Obviously, there's federal dollars that are coming. There's ability to move money around as the governor is trying to respond to this unfortunate event, be able to move dollars in the Treasury. We have a large economic stabilization fund. It was set in place for downturns in the economy to smooth out these unfortunate downturns. And so therefore, Texas, we have one of the largest ESF balances of all of the nations. And that's why I think, it's going to be rough. I mean, I was a first-time legislator in 2003 when we had a downturn in the economy and budget cuts. I was in the Senate in 2009. I've been through two of these, and I feel like I have scars on my back as a result. And this one, unfortunately, we're going to get more scars, but I know we got through those two, and we're going to get through this one. But we're going to have to do it with a combination of a lot of different options and utilize them because, again, we just don't know how deep or how far stretching this downturn is going to be.
Do you have a hunch about it? I mean, you were very quick to call this a recession. A lot of people were calling it, having various euphemisms for it. It's a blip. It's a temporary thing. You jumped in pretty early and said this is going to be a recession. These are the kinds of things that sort of restructure an economy, restructure what state government can do, restructure what local governments can do. You think this is a big one?
Well, I know that we are unfortunately in a recession. I just don't know how deep and how wide it's going to be. As we look back over the course of after the Saudis announced that they were going to increase production, I was concerned that itself could cause a global recession, and we didn't know how bad the pandemic was at that time. But I only talked to my staff about that. As we move forward in that week, as I told them, I said I'm very hesitant to use that R word. But as we got towards the back end of that first week, roughly there around the 12th, 13th, 14th of this month, and we started seeing Texas needing to implement a social distancing, there was no doubt a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. A lot of people are going to be furloughed. Part-time hourly workers are going to reduce their, and so it just, to me, it's not, you don't have the data, but it's pretty evident much of the world is shut down. You're going to have a recession. The problem is you just don't know how far reaching this is going to be. But I would rather go, I think it's critical to begin to manage expectations than wait until you're in the middle of it and go, oh my goodness, now it's too late to tell people that we need to start reacting to this.
So I'm gonna give you the out before I ask this question. I know it's not your job to decide what our taxes are going to be, but I'm sure the legislators are coming to you and saying, look, if we're going to lose all this money in sales taxes or oil severance taxes or property taxes or whatever it is, we might need some other sources of revenue. Is there a list somewhere? Or are you preparing some ideas for them about, if you had to raise more money, here's what you might look at?
Well, we had the one publication, the tax exclusion and exemptions publication. I always refer legislators, and I have ever since I've been in office, to that, because that gives you at least a first glimpse of, well, if certain industry sectors didn't have an exemption or exclusion, what would that mean for the state of Texas? What could that mean for the state or local governments? And so usually that's the first place we refer people to, just because it gives a first glimpse of numbers. Yet, I always tell people, if there was an easy solution, it would have been done a long time ago. Unfortunately, there's just no easy one-stop fix-it-all, because if it was, it would have been done quite a long time ago.
So that's kind of a catalog of the exemptions from current taxes, and if help me out, if I remember right, it was $58 to $60 billion in exemptions, things that aren't taxed under current taxes that we have now.
But whether that's sales tax or whether that's, automobile tax, property taxes, a combination of all of those, yet, sometimes you have to be careful because what looks like it's exempted in reality is taxed in another section of the code. And so, it may be exempt from regular sales tax, yet it's picked up somewhere else. And so, we typically walk members through that. And that's kind of a first start because, again, as you mentioned, they're the policymakers. They're the ones that set that course. However, I do think that, we've got a lot of different tools in the toolbox to be able to solve this. And we're going to get to work and start figuring out how to get past this.
What taxes are people asking you to cut? I know there was a conversation, particularly from the hospitality industry, starting in March about, maybe deferring sales taxes. You addressed this a little bit. Christy Craddock over at the Texas Railroad Commission has suggested, deferring severance taxes on oil and gas for a little bit. I assume that there are, conversations or pleas or whatever you want to call them from various places saying, hey, can you let your foot off the gas on this? How do you expect that to go, and what are your tools there?
Yeah, most of it has been a request on sales tax. And again, that was immediate because, as you mentioned, those in the restaurant industry, the bars, those that are collecting in February, to be able to hold on to those dollars for a few extra months. Again, unfortunately, as I told members, yes, I have the authority to defer, but the problem is that deferral, I can't pick and choose between certain industry sectors. It's an all or nothing. And that all this time would be across 254 counties, all 12 economic regions for every single industry sector. Or as you mentioned, the commissioner said yesterday, but then, we were talking with TIPRO and Texoga 3 weeks ago about
two
different
oil and gas
options.
associations, right?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I appreciate the letter and the highlight, but that was 2 weeks ago with the start of those conversations. So
Right.
we've been talking about whether it's the property values of what they're going to pay on oil and gas that's in the ground, much like we were talking about 2019 values versus 2020 values, whether there's different exemptions or opportunities in state statute. But state statute is pretty clear. I don't have that authority to target one industry sector or another industry sector.
Okay. So what do you expect is going to happen from the state level? What can you do from the state level to, to sort of ease people into this, to the extent that you can even ease people through a thing like this, businesses and industries?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that we need to make sure that we're doing is trying to work with those that are, struggling to make sure they get the right information. How do we make sure that businesses that are trying to continue to stay open, what are the tools that they now have because of the packages that Congress has recently passed, and make sure that they immediately have the information they need to be able to walk them through, to be able to hopefully get enough bridges to keep their businesses open and to keep their employees. I mean, that's the most important thing that I'm hearing from all businesses is they want to be able to keep their employees. They want to keep them employed. They don't want to put people on furlough or reduce their hours. And so really it's these different opportunities. How do we make sure they have the right information? Because, Texas, we can't print money. Unfortunately, DC can print money. And so, I'm not one to look to DC for solutions. But, the fact is, when you have a major global downturn like this, it's D.C. that can come with significant dollars. The state of Texas just doesn't have the ability to print money.
Walk me through the reporting mechanism here. We had a conversation before this interview about when news comes in. There was a moment in March when your office announced that February employment figures were pretty good in Texas. I think you said 55,000 jobs had been added, and it turned out to be the same week that we were hearing from the federal government that the economy had lost 3 million jobs. So there's a lag built into this. I know that you came out that about that same time your office announced that sales tax revenues reported in March were up, but those were reported for February sales before the coronavirus. The next report's going to be bad. Get us ready for the next set of reports. What are we walking into?
Well, as you mentioned, the unemployment numbers. I mean, the fact is Texas, 2 weeks ago, we had unemployment claims of roughly about 16,000 people. And then, as you know, a week ago, that was roughly ended with over 150,000 unemployment claims. And then that number went up last week to 276,000. And as you mentioned, on the national level, the old record, if I recall, was a little over 600,000 unemployment in 1 week back in 1982. And as you mentioned, 2 weeks ago, it was 3.3 million. And then last week was a little over 6.5 million. So unprecedented numbers that we're seeing here. And as you mentioned, that lag, yes, we're going to send the information out, but as we're sending out, some data for February, those numbers just are not relevant anymore. And so that's one reason that I wanted to get out and start managing expectations. And so, as I've mentioned to many members and people that I talk to, the first month that I will have any glimpse of real numbers for sales tax collections, and as you know, but in case anybody's listening may not recall offhand, of the state budget, a third is federal dollars. Of the 2/3 that is state dollars, the biggest portion is obviously tax collections. And of all tax collections, 58% is roughly sales taxes. And another 8% is motor vehicle sales and rental taxes. And so that's the reason I keep talking about sales tax, because that's the biggest determinator for at least the state budget. And so the first glimpse that we're going to have for the state is roughly my collections this month. However, that's only going to reflect roughly half of the impact in March. And so when we get April collections that'll come in May, that'll be the first true glimpse. So really around the 1st of June, we'll get a full month of what the economic slowdown because of trying social distance is really going to mean to the state budget.
Okay. Let me go back to something that I left out on the school finance thing. If property tax appraisals drop, surely they're going to drop in the Permian Basin, for example. That means less local property taxes for schools and things like that. That means more state money, a higher demand on state money. to sort of buttress that. Over the course of a recession, you would expect property values to probably fall, all over the state to some extent. This is one of the cases of the state demand for state money going up. Have you really started those conversations yet about where the state's load is going to increase?
Well, if you look at the two biggest determining factors for the state budget, those two load points are either going to be public education and health and human services. Those are the two biggest pressure points, at least for expenditures for the state of Texas. Now, as far as property values, if you look back over time, when we've had downturns, obviously all severance taxes are extremely volatile. They go up and down constantly. They typically go up and down by double digits or more. It's a commodity. It's very volatile. Sales tax, for example, in the last 20 years, about every 5 years, you have a downturn in the number. Even though they've averaged increases a little over 5%, about every 5 or so years, you have one blip that goes down. Property taxes in the last 20 years, they haven't gone down at all. They may be flat. Now, I do think in certain areas for certain property values, as you mentioned, severance values for oil and gas minerals are obviously going to go down. Whether residential, commercial, it's a little too early to tell. What of those may go up and down? But my point being is, Texas, before this downturn, was a strong economy. It's going to take us a little while, but we're going to return back to a strong economy. It's a place that people want to live, that want to raise their children, they want to work. Mm-hmm. And so, if you look at, I don't think you'll see a significant decrease in property values across the state of Texas, but you're right, that does have an impact to the state treasury as well as to state expenditures. But I think it's a little bit too early, unfortunately, to be able to see into the next biennium the revenue side and some of the expenditure side. But we are trying to look at all of that as we are walking through this on a daily and a weekly basis to be able to get at least better numbers that we can take our back of the envelope numbers and put them into more perfect data set points that we can give policymakers so they can make real decisions.
Do you have an idea, having been through the dot-com bust and through the recession in 2008, do you have an idea how long it'll be before, just roughly, before those policymakers have enough information to sit down and start making policy? Right now, it's fuzzy.
Yeah, it's fuzzy right now, without a doubt. But the fact is they're going to have to make decisions come January and next session. So they are going to be making real decisions. We're just going to try to get them the best data that we can so they have the right information to make those decisions, because they're going to make them come next session to set a new two-year state budget.
And you think that they can maybe go until then without having to meet on an interim basis? Do you have a feel for that?
I don't think that there's a need for them to come in for a special session. We have a lot of different flexibility. Leadership can move money around to deal with budgetary constraints that we may have to fight the coronavirus right now. Also, we have a large economic stabilization fund balance that we can use for cash flow purposes. But if something substantially changes from that, then obviously I will be the first to raise that to anyone in the coming weeks or coming months. But as of today, no, I don't think that there's a need for a special session.
Right. The ESF, the rainy day fund, as it's sometimes called, is filled largely with oil and gas money.
That is correct.
And I'm curious, how long a recession would, sort of imperil the state's ability to hit its savings account. You've got the savings account. It's got a lot of money in it right now, $9 billion, $8 billion, give or take. If you draw that down for this or that as you go through this recession, and if you've got an oil and gas problem that's not refilling that fund, at what point do those lines cross?
No, those are great questions. Fortunately, roughly an $8.5 billion or a little bit more is a significant amount of money that gives us cushion to be able to get through this bridge. I'm the last one that's going to predict what oil and gas prices are going to be in another year or 2 years. We give our official numbers, but my point being is it's extremely volatile. No one would have envisioned just literally 5 weeks ago that we would have dropped so fast as we have today. But we also know that take another year and a half, something could happen in the Middle East, something could happen in Russia, and we could see prices go back up. Now, I'm not predicting that today, but I'm just making a point that it's hard to see. Now, as I mentioned, we thought we would have transfer roughly after this fiscal year about $1.6 billion to the state's economic stabilization fund and the equal amount over to transportation. We think as of today, that's probably going to be a little more downward, about $1.2 billion. So it's still a significant amount of money. but it's going to be a little bit less, and it'll continue to be a little bit less over the course of the next few years. But I think we need to get a little bit further down the road to be able to start projecting out 2 and 3 years from now.
Okay, and you're not at a point yet where you can tell a legislator, here's the number, here's how much money you're not going to have in the current budget. Here's what you're going into as you go into that legislative session in January.
Yeah, no, not today. I mean, we're still trying to figure out exactly what does it mean to this current 2-year budget, which is the important base that you then build upon what is the next 2-year budget. And so, trying to predict out what the state economy is going to do starting in September of next year and going for the next 2 years, it's a little too early for that, unfortunately.
Well, this is a little bit of a strange question, but it's strange times. Do you have an idea what the Texas economy looks like now? I mean, we've closed all of these restaurants, hospitality places, bars, all of that. As you said, the state's hotels and motels are 3/4 empty.
Yes.
This is, it's a different time at the moment. How much of this is structural and how much of the way that you figure out what the economy's doing is going to change forever here? Any feel for that? Any conversation about that?
Well, I do think that this event is really going to change. It's going to have a major disruption in the way we do business from here forward. It's amazing that fortunately we're able to work. So many others are able to work teleworking. I've been pushing my agency to how do we do more telework over the course of the last 2.5 years to prepare for a younger generation, a more flexible, increased traffic. And so this is going to accelerate that to some degree, but obviously some businesses can, some businesses cannot. Revenue streams, I was cautioning already, talking about we needed to make sure and clarify that sales taxes that you and I, when we purchase something at our home via the internet that comes to our doorstep, that should go to the local community whereby we actually purchase that item and it's delivered. We needed to clarify that because the economy is transitioning so much more that is based on purchases on the internet. And, the fact is this is going to accelerate that significantly, but we just don't know exactly what are those winners and losers as far as business structures that we had in February of this year and what it's going to look like come February of next year because of these adjustments that we're having. But there is going to be major disruptions in the way we do business. You and I, who would have imagined last time we were together a month ago that we would be doing this via the internet and having our interviews from far away places. Right.
The public health people, in Texas and nationally are telling us that this is going to get worse before it gets better. Is that basically the same line for the economic news? Is this going to we're not at the bottom of this yet?
No, I mean, that's the reason I wanted to get out so early and start using that word recession, because I wanted to start managing expectations. We just don't know how long and how deep. But obviously, as you look at the pandemic, the question is, are we going to have another wave of it this fall? Will we have another wave of it next spring? Is it going to continue to circulate through the globe? Are we going to be able to have some medical breakthrough where we can do more accurate testing, more rapid testing to be able to quicker isolate those that are infected instead of having a social distancing policy of everyone in the state? Can we, target much more precisely and quickly those that unfortunately have got the coronavirus and be able to isolate them so we can have bigger portions of the economy going? Those are things that obviously so many smart people around the world are working on very quickly to try to come up with some solutions very rapidly. And that's part of the question is, I don't think you can look out if there's another round of it this fall or this spring, it'll be an exact parallel to what we're having today, because hopefully the really smarter people than me are be able to come up with much quicker ways to determine who has it, how do we isolate, how do we treat, is there an immunization, and hopefully if it unfortunately comes back around, we'll have a better way to be able to deal with this virus. And
all that stuff's got to get out of the way before the economy pops back.
It really does. Well, I mean, I think the economy, once if we are able to get past the next few weeks, start having the economy get back to going, as we've seen in other parts of the world that have been ahead of us as they're getting their economy going again. The question is if it comes back around, how do we respond to it that next time? And so parts of the economy are going to start picking back up. The question is how do we deal with this if we have to deal with it again when it comes back around?
Okay, right. Comptroller Glenn Hegar, I really appreciate your time this morning. Thanks for coming on. maybe we can do this over a cup of coffee sometime face to face.
Hey, sounds good. But until then, I'll have my coffee from afar. So good to be with you today, Ross. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in. To keep tabs on the latest coronavirus news in Texas, subscribe to our evening newsletter at trib.it/coronavirus. Thanks for listening.